Welcome to AviList, a birding podcast.
Hello. Welcome, everyone. This is AviList, a birding podcast. I am George Armstead here with my co-host, Alvaro Jaramillo. Alvaro, how you doing today?
Hello, doing well. In Canada right now, so in case anybody's wondering. Was in Japan, in Canada now.
The wilds of Canada, God's
That's
country
right.
up there.
Yeah, it's a big place, but I'm in part of it.
Nice. Excellent. Well, Al, we are very lucky today to be joined by two colleagues who are working on a new, well, maybe not so new, but it'll be new in its unveiling, AviList, which is a project of some 20 plus ornithologists are involved in the main committee, but a lot of folks are involved. We have Frank Rheindt and Marshall Iliff with us today to talk about this. This is going to be a big new taxonomy that will be published in June here of 2025. Welcome to the show, Frank and Marshall. And we're really glad to hear you guys. Maybe we'll start with some introductions. Frank, maybe you could introduce yourself to the AviList audience here.
All right. Thanks a lot, George, for having me on board here today. My name is Frank Rheindt. I'm an associate professor at the National University of Singapore. A keen bird watcher all my life. And I'm part of this great new project, this exercise that we're all trying to do to create a unified taxonomic list of all the birds in the world. Beyond that, I also serve on the ICZN, the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, which is basically the body that defines how new scientific names for animals have to be described, basically the rules that are set in place for describing new animal names, scientific names. I'm also involved in the conservation scene here in Southeast Asia where I live. There's a lot of local extinction, global extinction going on in birds here with the songbird crisis that we have. So that's also an area where I spend quite a lot of time on.
Nice. And pre-recording, folks, Frank has promised each of us that he will produce Malaysian rail babbler sightings for all. So, yeah, we're extremely excited for that. Frank, great to have you here and have you here with your colleague, Marshall Iliff. Marshall, you are one of the few guests we have had on twice now. A select group. So welcome back to the show. Maybe for those that missed the first one, maybe you can tell folks a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So Marshall Iliff, I'm one of the project leaders for eBird. I'm the data quality lead for eBird now, and have been in that role since 2007. George and I go way back to our childhood birding together. I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, and since then have pretty much been doing stuff with birds as much as I can all over the place. I'm in Boston now, live here, and I sort of got involved with this AviList project. It goes back to my first week at eBird when Brian Sullivan was sort of training me up on eBird and handed me a spreadsheet of the eBird taxonomy. And I took a look at the thing and said, this needs work. And there's something about like Excel files for me that just like sort of how I think about the world. And so just immediately I was in there tinkering, sort of like working with the subspecies and species. And my first big task was to like bring South American birds in and then bring global birds in. So I've sort of always been interested in bird taxonomy, not really formally trained, but just a really interested birder and sort of interested in how we categorize the birds around us. And that sort of led me to manage the eBird taxonomy all the way up through to today. Usually partnered with a real taxonomist, Tom Schulenberg originally, now Pam Rasmussen, now that Tom's retired. But all that has sort of led me to really wanting to see just a lot more standardization around the world in bird taxonomy.
Nice.
I should say that maybe like with Saturday Night Live, we're eventually going to get like special jackets for guests who have been on 5 times. And see, you're now number 2, Marshall. So
You're getting
3
there,
more
pal.
to go, getting there. And I
Mhm.
got to say, Frank, half of I would say like 50% of the really cool papers that come out that I read, your name is on them. Even today I was reading a paper on Doraditos, something brand new, and there you were. And so I was like, it's a lot of some cool work you've done with tyrant flycatchers and all sorts of other birds, of course, all over in the old world. But it's a real pleasure to have you, both of you here, talking with a subject that I think a lot of folks that listen to this know we enjoy, and then some of they've told us that they really like the taxonomy talk. So,
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Al. The Doradito project was actually spearheaded by my good friend Nacho Areta in Argentina. He's on top of that, and he basically just approached me, and we were able to support him with sequencing technology and methodologies using next generation sequencing. So that was how I got into that. But yeah, most of my other suboccene tyrant flycatcher work is from a long time ago, from the time of my PhD, which was when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth back in the old days.
The old days.
Nice. Yeah, well, we're here to talk about a pretty fascinating project here. And I was talking to Marshall earlier about this, and I think it was 2018, was it the IOU then, the convention in Vancouver. And I happened to be there as a sort of supporting vendor role. I was telling Marshall I had to give one of the most embarrassing talks of my career, and that is saying something, ladies and gentlemen, because I've given a lot of embarrassing talks, but this one was probably the worst. I had to stand in front of an audience at this convention where all the ornithologists were like showing up, and I was like just a fanboy, and I thought it was going to be like super fun and to give this talk, but there was no audience. They had no seats really or anything. They just had me talking in front of people walking around. But it was really bizarre. I remember actually seeing Margaret Atwood there. There was a sighting of Margaret Atwood. It was my only sighting of her ever. That was a lifer that I shan't forget. But what I also remember was that I looked at the schedule for this meeting, and I saw an event on there that was about unifying the 4 major taxonomies of the world. And because of my schedule as a vendor, I basically couldn't go to anything. But I looked at this and I was like, I can actually go to that one. And I was like, but man, that's going to be like a giant lecture hall. There's going to like everybody at this convention is going to be at that thing. I'll be lucky to get a seat. And I go, and there's like between 30 and 40 people there, but they're all like super well-known ornithologists and me. And Frank Gill and Marshall were among sort of the main hosts. And Frank actually had everybody go around, introduce themselves, and talk about this project a little bit. So I have been curious to see how things are going. Here we are quite a few years later. And maybe a good way to start talking about this would be to kind of talk about the idea of what a taxonomy actually is, and how it is used. Maybe Frank, you want to start off with that one? It's a biggie.
All right. Yeah. So taxonomy, when you announce the word, it sends down shivers down the spine of many people. It sounds like very scary, but it's really just a way in which we classify the organisms around us. So taxonomy was started by this guy, Carl Linnaeus. He was mostly a botanist, but also a zoologist, and he started this in 1758. That was the first time that people started to put together the diversity of animals and plants around them into categories that make sense. And this is a hierarchical system. So you start from the top in birds, that would be the class of birds. And then you classify them into different orders. Each of these orders can be classified into different families. Those families, again, into different genera. And you end up with species at the bottom. Actually, with subspecies. You can classify species further into subspecies. So that's been around for 2.5 centuries, and it's been pretty successful, I would say. It's the way that we all think about nature these days. We use Linnaean scientific names. These are also widely known as Latin names in our communication with other people. We ornithologists are a bit unusual in that we're one of the only disciplines of zoology where we resort to English names commonly, but that's not very widespread in other disciplines of zoology. Most people just go by Latin names. And the one thing that's been a bit of a hindrance in taxonomy is that in birds, there's a huge interest, global interest in all the birds of the world. And that has led to a variety of parallel efforts in taxonomy. So up until just a couple of years ago, we've had 4 global checklists that have been widely followed, and we have lots of regional efforts. And the listeners of this podcast are probably most familiar with North America, with the AOS, and with the North American Classification Committee, NACC and NAC, that's maintaining its own North American classification of birds. So we've got a lot of parallel efforts across the world. And while that may have some upsides, it means that there's a lot of independent people thinking about things from different perspectives. It also has a lot of downsides, because when it comes to the end user, to people in government, to people who are interested in trade regulations, to people who are interested in conservation, it's not necessarily the best thing to have 7 different lists to resort to. You need to have one unified list that brings everyone together at the table and where we can agree, okay, what are we going to do about this species and that species? And that's where AviList steps in. That's what we're trying to do now. We're going to create this unified global checklist, a taxonomic checklist of birds that's going to bring all the parties together at one table.
Excellent. Yeah. I think everyone certainly on this call has been on overseas trips where you're struggling to find some bird in the field guide only to realize that you know exactly what it is, but it's just a completely different name.
Well, I also think that one of the things that birders sometimes confuse, or not confuse, but that think about the entire taxonomic process as a scientific process, but it is equally a people process, like in a sense, a political process. So kind of like the way that, when we say, we're getting the Paris Accord, we're getting all these countries together to agree on some standards for global warming issues and so forth. I feel like this is sort of a similar thing where you have all, like you said, all these different groups trying to do the same thing, but with different, in a sense, they're not right or wrong. They're different opinions, and that's where it's more. That's where the non-science, is sort of more subjective part, comes in. Where I think that's the real beauty of a list that is done by this bigger group of people, and we sort of start saying, okay, this is the one, or at least this is the one that we can get behind because it has a lot of players in it, right?
Yeah, Al, I would just jump in and say, like, I totally think that's the right framing, that it's a people problem. It's also like an organizational problem for those people. It's like, as soon as you publish a checklist of the world's birds, then Frank in his lab put out 3 papers like the next day that rearranged the, sunbirds over here and the shamas over here and the doraditos in South America. And someone has to be on top of that and sort of like read that paper, understand its implications, figure out how it fits into your list. And sort of early in the process, when we were sort of doing this grand comparison sheet of these different lists, like often it was sort of just a timing thing. Like you could see that Birdlife looked at this paper over here, and then IOC picked up this one, but Clements missed it, but Clements got this one, but missed that one. And it's just like, with all these independent parties sort of proceeding with their own systems at different rates, sort of, mostly as volunteers, it just left a lot of gaps. And so like part of the impetus was like, can we figure out a better way that sort of makes sure we stay truly current and consider these sort of new hypotheses as soon as they are available.
So I think we sort of understand the need for this. It's and we'll continue to talk about that. And it's largely a matter of communication, but has other implications as well. But how would you say that this effort really began? What was was there a particular point in time that kind of kicked it forward, or was it more of a slow build?
So, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Vancouver, and it's like in my head, that is the beginning of this. It actually started a few years earlier at the, and even earlier than that, sort of just discussions between the IOC team, which Frank Gill was representing, and me and Tom Schulenberg and some others. It just sort of had this idea percolating, like maybe the IOU in Vancouver is the time to try to assemble people. And so in advance of that, we sort of had done this duck project where we said, okay, like, how are we going to do this? Okay, let's take all the waterfowl of the world, look at how these lists mismatch. Like, how would we hypothetically try to resolve this? And so we had a big call with, assembled a bunch of sort of the ultimate team members, and then a month or two of sort of discussions back and forth. Do we split the green-winged teal or not split the green-winged teal? Do we split the bean geese or not split the bean geese? Mexican duck, yes or no? And so that sort of gave the context for how we might approach this. And then at the IOU in Vancouver, there was the public talk that you were at, but in and around that, there were all these like meetings in the beer hall here, or the like restaurant here, or like, outside the talk here, trying to figure out like, how can we actually put this thing together?
Smoke-filled room, I'm sure.
Smoke-filled room stuff. Yeah. But I
also got to say, that's truly bean counting, bean goose counting.
But after that happened, there was sort of a lot of just, I won't call it bureaucratic sign off, but there was like a couple years of sort of trying to get everyone to agree to just, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure we can follow through? How are we actually going to get it done?
Get the ducks in a row, as they say.
Get our ducks in a row, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we kicked off in like just before COVID, in the like month, or it's like February of 2020, with our first milestone, which was revisiting the same ducks that we had sort of done as an experiment before, but now we were doing them for real. So, and then it went 5 years of sort of dealing with 30 to 40 issues per month, that had been these mismatches between taxonomies, and trying to keep up with new stuff coming in, that got us to sort of a final list where we'd reconciled these.
I think, if I remember right, you guys did the waterfowl leading into that meeting, and so you had members from each of the four major taxonomies kind of weighing in, and I think like one of the main sort of salient points was like, look, this isn't going to be insurmountable. It'll take time, but you guys, all four taxonomies, I think, agreed on like 94% or more of species. Really, it was a lot of arguing over a fairly small number of instances within the taxonomy.
Yeah.
These, my friends, are strange days. I forget who said the quote, "May you live in interesting times," but frankly, folks, I have had enough of it. I say a departure is in order, and I think you ought to join me. Yes, this March of 2026, me, George Armistead, my good friend and colleague Molly Brown, and our good friend Surya Ramachandran are joining some other LifeList friends for an incredible safari to the state of Assam in East India. We'll visit 3 different national parks, Kaziranga, Nameri, and Manas. We will go for rhinos, elephants, and a whole bunch of primates, including things like capped langur, hoolock gibbon, and even Gee's golden langur. But it's not just about the mammals, and there are others that I didn't even mention. There's many birds, of course. The greater adjutant, or as it's known locally, the hargila, which means bone swallower, an endangered species whose stronghold really is the Brahmaputra River Valley that will be in the entirety of our trip there. The Bengal floricon, critically endangered, a very strange small bustard that should be engaged in courtship at this time. This is a good time to see it. You should go with us. You can look for black eagle, white-bellied Erpornis, rufous-necked laughing thrush, white-winged duck, rufous-necked hornbill, ibisbill perhaps, slender-billed vulture, maybe even Jordan's babbler, There's a whole bunch of birds. It's going to be a good time. I hope you'll join us in March of 2026 in Assam.
And furthermore, I think once we actually took a look at all, something like 1,000 different sort of issues to consider, there was huge consensus among the group on most of those, which sort of gets to this problem with timing being the biggest problem. But then there were some just legitimately hard ones that, were a split vote, 50-50, and how do we break the tie? Green-winged teal is a great example of it's a really hard one. Different people have considered them species or not species. And
I mean, I recall some of there was sort of confusing data from some of the early genetic work on the green-winged teals, in that we had, the North American green-wing seemingly being more closely related to the South American, yellow-billed speckled teal, and that, which may be a situation where it's probably not looking at the right set of genes, maybe, to really tell you what the history is. I don't know, Frank, if that's something that eventually came through in changing people's opinions.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right on that. With a lot of studies, including the green-winged teal, there was a lot of reliance initially, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, on mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is just a tiny little part of the genome of each individual. And the reason why people have been so reliant on that type of DNA is because it was, I think, simply speaking, it was the easiest way to analyze data 20 years ago. But we have gone through a revolution in the meantime. About 15 years ago, a new technology came up, next generation sequencing technology, NGS, which allows us to sequence probably 1,000 times more DNA within a particular time span than we used to be able to do. Now we can just do entire genomes, where we only used to be able to do a single mitochondrial gene. And it changes the entire story. I keep telling my students, anything that we did with mitochondrial DNA in the 1990s and 2000s is up for re-litigation. You can really do it again. I just had a lab meeting yesterday with my students, and we were looking at this great new paper that came out from Australia about the reed warblers from the Pacific Ocean. There's a radiation of these reed warblers. And mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA, said something about them, and it was all wrong. Now, with the nuclear DNA, they've shown all of this to be wrong, and they're going back to the old way that they had been classified. A lot of that is true for many of these taxonomic, these tough nuts that Marshall mentioned, the ones that we're arguing a lot about, where mitochondrial DNA gave us a little bit of information in the beginning, but now we really need to encourage labs across the world to do the nuclear DNA, the entire genomes on those. I think the toughest case that I remember across these 5 years of our taxonomic panel, considering all of these incongruences among the global checklists, was probably the Wimbrels, where our committee has gone back and forth on it. Is it Hudsonian Wimbrel versus Old World Eurasian Wimbrel, or is it just one species? And yeah, there's some definitely some legitimately tough cases. The reason for that is because the evolutionary process isn't stepwise, but it's continuous, and you're going to have a bunch of species complexes where intelligent people will disagree. They will simply not come to one conclusion, where it's at the cusp. You could either go with a split or a lump. Both of them, it's in the gray zone, and both of these treatments would be equally viable. And I think that's what the Wimbrels were at the end of the day. So where we had a lot of, not fighting, but it was a lot of well-natured back and forth in our committee on what we should do. And Marshall, I think we ended up with a split in the end with the Wimbrels, right?
I think we did.
Yeah.
A split meaning a split meaning that Hudsonian will be split, or
that's right. North America will get its own.
Yes,
Wimbrel.
yes, Al. We've been talking about this one. Yes, our time is here. The Hudsonian Wimbrel has arrived.
I was watching, so the Siberian version of the Wimbrel the other day, and listening to them and thinking, gosh, they sound just like Wimbrels. I could not tell. I was as much as I'm like, boy, they look different, but boy, they sound alike. But then I was thinking, gosh, maybe I'm going to rethink this. Then I saw Greenshank fly up, and I'm like, boy, that just sounds like a greater yellowleg. And I thought, oh, hold on a second. Maybe I'll rethink again, and how you interpret info is really important, right? And sometimes it's really clear cut when you have differences, but similarities sometimes are not as it's as if they tell you less than difference, right? So, and then when two things sound alike, and what do you do? Or they look alike, like a lot of seabirds.
I love
What do
that
you do?
the big differences in that example are the white wedge up the rump in both cases, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right.
I think the Wimbrels, like as you mentioned, this is a very instructive case of how we went about this whole business. So in our discussions, we mentioned that as well. Like some of us came up with the fact that, hey, their flight calls are exactly the same. What are you going to do about that? But then again, the courtship vocalizations may not be. Now, they're not very well known, but the thing that they do, the flight call, these flight songs, this display flights on the breeding grounds, they're very poorly known, but they seem to be quite different from what we know, although we need a lot more documentation. So yeah, it's looking at the entirety of the evidence, and I think what swayed most of us is genomic data. There's like high quality genomic data now that's showing us that they really haven't been interbreeding a lot, even though they've had a bunch of opportunities. There have been land connections across the Bering Strait, that sort of thing. So Earth historically, they've had a bunch of opportunities for interbreeding, and they just haven't taken them. So in those cases, I think we tend to believe the birds. The birds themselves don't seem to view each other as members of the same species, so we should probably believe them rather than our own preconceived notions about how similar or different they have to be for us to believe that they're different species.
One of the cool ones that sort of comes up there. I mean, you guys have started talking about genetics, but like a lot of times the genetic information wasn't available. So, wearing my eBird hat,
it's about time you finally put it on.
It was really fun to see how much like Macaulay Library and the imagery, both imagery and sounds, in conjunction with Xenocanto and other resources, but like the wealth of information now for like live birds in the field, audio recording that was used by this panel was really cool. And there, and it for the photo piece, like so often the soft part colors are so important to sort of species recognition. The rusty-cheeked scimitar babbler versus red-eyed scimitar babbler wasn't something that came straight out of this group. It came out of like a modern analysis of these two subspecies that are totally allopatric, like in totally different areas. But once the photos show up, like one of them's got a red eye, one of them's got a white eye, like the rest of the plumage is different. But it was sort of missed in the specimens before just how different these things were. And then the vocalizations, like duetting vocalizations, were different. So it's like even when there's not vocal information, we're sort of in this new era of just lots of imagery and sounds that can be drawn on as we're sort of reassessing these. Nothing of that is unique to AviList, like it's happening with all these committees, but it was just really fun to go back to some of these that had been tricky before, but then people could just like pull up the sounds and be like, wow, these are really different.
Do you think like some of the classic, well, you've mentioned Wimbrel, but one of the classics is, yellow rump warbler that people have kind of gone back and forth on, is with all the new data and also with all of these heads all over the world looking at the problem, sometimes people from outside of North America that sort of don't have maybe a vested interest in it as much as just seeing what the data is, that it'll be actually much easier to resolve those things and actually come up to like split them, boom, and everybody's going to be happy? Or do you think it's going to maintain that level of I don't know, back and forth? Or do you think it's getting easier in a sense over time to do this kind of work that AviList is doing with tough and well-watched kind of groups, where we're all paying attention to them?
I think that's a really good question, Al. And my personal outlook on this would be that I think it's always going to remain tough. There's always going to be a bunch of hard nuts, like tough nuts to crack taxonomically. Simply because, as we said earlier, the evolutionary process is continuous. There's always going to be these gray zone cases where reasonable people can disagree. Is it one species, two or three species? And so no matter how much data you throw at these cases, they're always going to remain controversial. And the yellow rump warblers are probably amongst those. So yeah, I wouldn't expect that we're going to find like a be all and end all solution overnight. And yeah, bringing in people from overseas is going to make it easier, right? So what we are offering though with AviList is that in the future, for many of these species complexes, you're going to have the one checklist to go to in order to see, okay, what's currently the most widely accepted taxonomic treatment these days? What should we adopt perhaps for our state legislation, for our, I don't know, for my birding checklist, if you will, right? As opposed to the past where you would have had a choice of 4 or 5 different sources, right? At the same time, we at AviList, we don't want to be in the way of taxonomic progress. So this is something that's very close to my heart, and I have to be careful how I speak about this because some of the things that I say about this topic might not be in line with how other people, including within our group, think about this. But I feel very strongly that we at AviList are not in the business of impeding taxonomic progress. For example, by saying, hey, this is our list, you've got to use this now. You're not allowed to deviate from it, right? If there are taxonomists out there who disagree with some of the treatments in our list, they're very much welcome to go out there, to disagree with us, to publish that data that shows that we have been wrong on this, there needs to be a taxonomic change. So we don't want to be in the way of this at all. And that's a very important point that we need to state, because a lot of times people see these authoritative lists and they hide behind them. They say, hey, this is how AviList treats it. We should go by this treatment now, and you're not allowed to deviate from it. So if there's a genuine taxonomic disagreement, we encourage that. We want people to come forth. But if there's just end users that are not in the taxonomic arena, end users such as bird watchers, government people, trade people, conservation people that just want to have a list to work with, we very much encourage them to use our list. We believe that our list will be the unified consensus across the world.
I'll build on that, which isn't not exactly like a counterpoint, because I agree with everything that Frank said, but I think the perspective of like the real value of aligning the list, like for me coming from eBird, it really like comes down to sort of cyberspace, like the modern world of the internet. Like we've got all these people studying birds in all these places. And one of the core challenges is like plugging this data together. And like just one example. So, the Cornell lab, in addition to eBird and Merlin, Birds of the World project is sort of life histories, originally the Handbook of Birds of the World, then that moved into sort of the Cornell space combined with neotropical birds and Birds of North America series. So it's, meant to be sort of authoritative life histories for all birds of the world. And one of the key pieces is like, what's the conservation status of these birds? So that IUCN Red List is sort of run in the Birdlife taxonomy. And so we want to reflect, what's the health of these populations, like which ones are critically endangered, which ones are extinct, which ones are, least concern, sort of like not really a conservation problem at the moment. But when you have like 5% disagreement on the species of the world, we literally can't show those because they assess these birds based on, maybe a range that includes the Nearctic and Palearctic, but then eBird and AOS have split them into 2 species. So three-toed woodpecker is an example where BirdLife has done a different split than North American. So like they've never looked at sort of the conservation status of these 2. So and so that's just one example, but there's all these like chunks of data that just don't fit together when you're not talking the same language taxonomically. So like from my perspective, it's been a push towards like the more standardization, the more we can like munge these data together, which kind of brings efficiencies of scale and it lets those conservation dollars kind of go to the right place, rather than like a bunch of different groups sort of considering these things separately. At the same time, like taxonomic freedom is good. We want that to sort of funnel into the grand process. If someone realizes that AviList is like out to lunch on Wimbrel and can really tell us how to fix them, then we want that to like filter into the process.
I'm still convinced you got Wimbrel right. So, yeah. So I think this is going to air this episode in June, probably right around the 14th of June. I think AviList will be published for the first time maybe just a few days before that, if I remember correctly. and perhaps I'm asking you to repeat yourself here, but if what do you think will be something that sort of a North American birder, or any birder for that matter, might notice right away if they looked at AviList or something happened as a result of AviList? And what excites you about publishing this? Maybe I'd ask each of you that question and perhaps it'd be the same answer, but what excites you about this and what it might do for the average birder, say? Maybe Frank, I'll start with you.
All right, thanks. So what is it that will excite the North American birder the most? Maybe I'll defer to Marshall on that. I might just say that, well, first of all, we want all of your listeners to go to www.avilist.org. We're going to launch on the 10th of June. So by the time your listeners listen to this, they will be able to go there, download the list, look at it in all its beauty. One thing that might strike North American listeners is that maybe our English names, I don't know if we want to wade into that, but we are a global checklist. So we have kind of agreed on being very flexible with that because we have a global audience. So we're going to stick to well-established names that have been around for a long time. Our default names are those that had been used by the IOC list. So one of the 4 global taxonomic lists that existed before AviList. Those are the ones that were taken over. However, users are going to have their own choice of which names they want to use. So if they want to use AOS names instead, there's a different column for that. So there's a lot of options and flexibility for end users, but maybe some of them will be surprised to see certain names that sometimes there's a British and an American version. Actually, there's more to that. There's sometimes an Indian English version. There's an Australian English version. We have lots of Asian English versions of names that are not necessarily used in North America or Europe. So there's all of that. That's probably going to be new to many users in North America. What do you think, Marshall?
Yeah, certainly the English name piece is, this is not an English name standardization project. This is really get the taxonomy right, and it includes not just sort of the scientific name and the family and genus that all of these go into, but a lot of sort of bibliographic information that's really been standardized and sort of checked. In addition to sort of layering in to bring value to the list, layering in some of the data from other resources. So like Birds of the World link is accessible in there, and like Frank said, in sort of the longer version of the list, there's 2 spreadsheets. There's a long one and a short one. The longer version, we do show the like Birdlife name, eBird Clements name, and the AviList name. And we sort of expect those entities to maintain a little bit of, just like we have taxonomic freedom to have different opinions, we have English name freedom too. To me, that really aligns with sort of how we've approached that in eBird. Anyone in eBird can set, UK English names or Indian English names or Australian or New Zealand or Bangladesh or India, et cetera, et cetera. And that, that lets people, call it gray plover when they're in Europe and call it black-bellied plover in North America. And we're not trying to like get in the middle of that dispute. Like it's fine to have different names for these birds. So that'll definitely be striking. I think otherwise it's not going to be that striking because eBird has been sort of in the room on this all along and morphing its taxonomy explicitly to be ready for this moment when AviList is released and we can say, actually, eBird is almost perfectly aligned with AviList. There are very few things that are different. A lot of the things that are different are going to be resolved this year. So there's things like a split in strided heron, which is kind of a cool one. Not just lava heron, but an old world, new world split in strided heron is coming. Phaeas and desertus petrel are going to be a new challenge for any folks.
Mixed emotions about that. Yeah. That's great and terrifying all at once. Yeah.
Have been at sea in the Atlantic. Be careful with elegant trogons going forward. Coppery-tailed trogon will be the North American, the United States and northern Mexico one, and then elegant trogon is farther south in Central America and southern Mexico. Brits and Europeans are going to be excited about red grouse split from willow ptarmigan. A lot of them are.
Right.
have a heads up on that one. That's another of these like real edge cases.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember how Frank voted, but it's a real interesting one to sort of try to decide.
Just having a species named red grouse will be fun, I think.
Yeah. Which
I
is
almost don't want to reveal how I voted because there's a lot of tough opinions on this one.
You can drink the whiskey without saying, "Well, the taxonomy is all incorrect."
That's right.
At least Wild Turkey got it right.
I'm headed to Scotland for my first time in a month, so that's going to be it's going to make
nice.
that trip more rewarding for me. Dotterel and red grouse. So
there you go. Have some famous grouse and black grouse while you're there.
Yeah. I did think that it's a global taxonomy. You're publishing the paper in English, but in fact, the taxonomy can be used by anybody speaking any language, and it's a good thing you point out that the English name is a component that is flexible, because obviously there's Spanish names, there's Argentinian names, there's Chilean names, there's Peruvian names for all these things too. And the important thing is to know what your base entity that you're working with is that most people agree on. So, and that you can name whatever way you want within your local language, right? And so I think that's the beauty of this list, is that when you're obviously, English is the language of science, so we publish these things in English, but it's the full taxonomy anybody can use all over the world.
I think we can definitely envision sort of a future version of this that's a bit more of a live, interactive thing where you can say, I want to see the Swedish name with this. And Swedish is not a coincidence to pick. Like, the Swedish Ornithological Society is super excited about that's coming out, and like has an advanced copy that they're aligning with the Swedish names as we speak. So, but eBird Birds of the World, in addition to 15 different versions of English, has, Spanish, Swedish, Thai, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, a couple different versions. Like almost every language around the world has at least partial translations. And the more everyone's talking the same language, like, one of the biggest challenges in my sphere has been trying to match up Croatian bird names that are using an old version of IOC taxonomy and match it up to the latest version of Clements, because the Croatians want to have bird names in eBird. And so I've just done like endless matching and writing to them and being like, you realize, like, you guys are splitting the green-winged teal, but we don't split the green-winged teal. And so we need to like redo the names to sort of match the taxonomy just constantly. So in the space of sort of like global coordination in non-English languages, I hope this is a huge step forward.
I got a question too. Well, maybe just an observation. So, because now the average birder is an eBird user, the taxonomy that eBird uses becomes almost the taxonomy that somebody assumes is the global taxonomy. But you're saying, in a sense, it's not. eBird will try to eventually line up with AviList, but AviList will be sort of the greater umbrella. Or how's that going to work? I guess, is it all just going to be a kind of a fluid way that things kind of, as changes happen in one sphere, they get accepted by, let's say NAC makes a change, then AviList makes that same change, then eBird, or how do all those pieces kind of pull together? Is it more like you get together in that smoke-filled room, like George says, and say, let's try to do something together on this rather than separate? Maybe there is no answer to this, but
yeah. So to me, that's the core question. I would start by saying, though, that until Frank Rheindt is a passionate eBirder, we can't say that all birders around the world are
oh wow, Frank,
aligning with
eBird.
But
heavens,
despite lots of popularity in Singapore,
Andy voted the wrong way on Wimbrel. Heavens.
I've got my little Excel sheet that I've been maintaining since the 80s. So, back then Excel didn't exist. So now,
old dogs, new tricks.
Marshall is giving me a hard time for not having switched yet. But I'm a fan of eBird, right? But I think, Al, you said maybe there's no answer to this. I think there's a very specific answer to this. basically, by 10th of June, once we have launched AviList, there's an understanding among 3 of these 4 global checklists that they will eventually discontinue existing. So that doesn't mean that eBird will discontinue to exist, but it'll simply defer to AviList taxonomy. There won't be any separate eBird Clements taxonomy anymore. I think that switch is gradual for most of these bodies. IOC and eBird, they're going to be a little bit quicker in that. Birdlife reserves the right to be a bit slower in that. And we understand because Birdlife, they have a lot of, basically every taxonomic change costs them a lot of manpower in terms of doing the due diligence on the back end to see what's the new conservation status of the newly defined entities. So that's why they are going to take maybe a couple of years or more to fully align with AviList. But the other 2 lists, they're going to basically cease to exist. Not immediately, but gradually. So basically, there will only be AviList at the time. And I think it's also worthwhile to point out, maybe this hasn't come out so explicitly yet, that all of these other lists, especially IOC and eBird, have been aligning with AviList. They're basically, as Marshall mentioned earlier, they're more or less 99% the same thing right now because of this gradual alignment process over the last 4 to 5 years. So our AviList taxonomic committee has been sitting around for about 4 to 5 years now, adjudicating on roughly, well, it's difficult to count because there's different ways of counting it, but roughly 1,500 to 2,000 cases, maybe anywhere between 1 to 2,000 cases where there had been incongruences among the 4 existing global checklists. So there's been an inordinate amount of manpower going into this, people sitting around voting, discussing, contemplating which taxonomic treatment to adopt. There was a formal process for this. So the taxonomic committee consists of 8 to 9 people, and our decisions were by majority consensus, so majority rule. And so we had official votes on all of these, hundreds of cases, and IOC and eBird have been aligning on a basically annual basis or twice a year. Marshall will know more about this than I do. So twice a year, whenever they update their lists, they would have been aligning with the decisions that had been taken. So many of these latest updates that you see to eBird and to IOC over the last few years are actually AviList decisions that had been adopted by IOC and by eBird in order to align with AviList.
Yeah, I would go further to say that also extends to NAC and SAC, so the North American Committee and the South American Committee. So a lot of what has gone through the North American group in the past, 4 to 5 years, sort of had its genesis in the AviList project. So Terry Chesser, who's the chair of NAC, was part of the AviList team. Pam Rasmussen she is on all the taxonomic groups. She's part of IOC. She's part of eBird Clements. She's part of NAC, not formally part of Birdlife. So not all, but she's doing a lot in the taxonomic sphere. But that has meant that we had to look at house wrens because Birdlife has always split Cozumel wren. So that prompted Pam to say, I got to dust off the proposal on house wrens and, do justice to the Caribbean ones that don't look anything like house wrens, don't sound anything like house wrens, are of high conservation importance. And so that proposal sort of started in AviList and made its way through that committee. And there's just example after example after example, pick anything that NAC has done. It's sort of a coin flip now, whether it's sort of, had its genesis in sort of a new paper or someone who sort of took a new look at an old problem, or one of these AviList problems, the Puerto Rican Euphonia split, the Rufous nape wren split, all those things were sort of coming out of AviList directly. And sometimes, cattle egrets, intermediate egrets, and these are all things that had been treated differently elsewhere in the world. And it was sort of time that North America took a look at it and, built on the evidence that was sort of built up by the, a little bit less, I'm not going to say less rigorous, but less detailed sort of proposal process, but sort of everyone throwing their expertise in on these votes then led to sort of the more detailed proposals to the North American and South American Committee. And then in South America, it's sort of the same thing is happening. So.
It's actually really I mean, I'm really glad you sort of clarified that part, because that's huge. That's, having the other lists essentially say, you know what, we've done the job, kind of to get to this spot where we can join up with others and have this global list, and we're happy that this is happening, and we're fine not continuing our separate independent work. That's really amazing. Like, that's a huge. I'm sure there'll be, at the start of any change, there's always going to be some kind of, people are going to whatever, they're going to have their points of view. But I think that from the inside, from what you have all done and the people involved to make it so that really this is a list that has a stamp of approval of the other lists is huge. Like, it's really mind blowing that we've gotten to this spot, at this time, and that eBird, which most people use, is going to be essentially following this global list is really fantastic too. So it sort of really simplifies a lot of this for average folks, and hopefully for government folks, and hopefully for other people who aren't in the birding world that use these taxonomies. That's really great.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, that gets back again to the people challenge. That really the core challenge here was sort of getting all these folks coming at this problem from different places, whether it's sort of academic sphere or Birdlife, kind of really explicitly in the conservation sphere, eBird, sort of the bioinformatics and like birdwatcher sphere, along with NAC and SAC. So just sort of keeping all these groups together and sort of hearing all the perspectives on why this is important, and how we should move on these things and how we should decide them. It's really great to see it sort of still together and sort of entering the next phase, which will be, okay, now that we publish this thing, how do we go forward and like continue to keep up with new science coming out and changes that we didn't address. I mean, it's worth saying that we addressed every case where one of these three to five lists, depending on whether you count NAC and SAC as different. Those were so aligned with eBird that basically we talk about as three global lists. But we'll have the challenge of sort of keeping up with the new stuff. And so, as you can imagine, while we've been trying to get this thing published, all these new papers have been piling up. They're like, oh, shoot, we need to look at this. We need to look at this. NAC and SAC are continuing to sort of like push the envelopes forward in those regions. And all of those will in turn sort of make their way through this committee. But it's in a super collaborative space right now where there's just tons of communication between those committees. I don't know, Frank can talk a little bit more about sort of the vision going forward, but yeah, it's been a people and organizational challenge as much as sort of just the grunt work of the science and assessment.
Yeah, I agree with everything Marshall just said. And the 10th of June will mark the end of what we consider phase 1 of AviList, but it'll also mark the beginning of phase 2. And that's an exciting, brave new world that's coming up. Basically, phase 2 will define what AviList is going to be in the future. And we want to be the kind of body, we want AviList to be a living document, something that's continually getting updated. It's not going to be set in stone. This is very important for people to realize that might be unhappy with some of the changes that we've implemented. Since we've gone live with announcements that we're going to publish this new AviList, and people found out that some of their pet birds are getting lumped, and they're really unhappy, and they're writing to us, and how can you do this? Well, none of this is set in stone. If you believe that there's evidence out there that we have been wrong, we want you to go ahead and publish that stuff or convince us. There's going to be a way of launching proposals that are going to be considered by our taxonomic committee. The rough model that we envisage is the one that's currently adopted by NAC and SAC. They have a really nice way of considering proposals. Some of these proposals can come from the public even, and we're going to have a very similar thing. One of the features of our system will be regional advisory groups all over the world. We have 6 of them, right, covering all the major zoogeographic zones. And these regional advisory groups will be the ones that are going to be implicated in channeling some of these proposals through us. They're going to be looking over our shoulders with regards to regional decisions that we make, making sure that we we include the world in this. We don't want this to be a top-down approach, a prescriptive taxonomy that we basically force upon the world. We want this to be a collaborative effort that includes members of the ornithological community from throughout the world. And that's our challenge in phase 2 coming forward. And I think we're all very excited about it.
Yeah, I just saw a paper. Obviously, you're talking about egrets, for example, and striated herons and these global, wide-ranging species in Dutch birding on non-breeding bill patterns of great egret, and I was pretty blown away, like that they clump out. I mean, at least the paper does a pretty good job of convincing you they clump out into these different bill patterns in the non-breeding season. And then you thought, well, they also have different bill patterns and leg colorations in the breeding season. I was just thinking, like, boy, I mean, like, I guess this is more than one species, and I was thinking, like, what else would one need at this point? Like in the cases like that, would you think, this is a question I often get by birders that I'm traveling with, does a taxonomic split need to have a genetic component in today's world, or and you've sort of mentioned one already, but what is your thought? Like, how do you deal with these things when there is no, or maybe there is already published, but let's say there isn't?
I'm super happy that you're asking this, Al. The answer is most definitely no, a resounding no. There doesn't have to be genetic information. In fact, for I think more than half of our AviList decisions, there was absolutely no genetic information. I'm happy you're mentioning the great egrets. In my mind, they have been a stepchild of avian taxonomy. I mean, that split's been coming, it has been a long time in the making. And I'm happy that finally there's a paper in Dutch Birding, right, which is basically a birding magazine. And the AviList Taxonomic Committee will consider such evidence. Papers that are in the gray zone, the literature, like the gray literature, which is not peer-reviewed scientific literature, but maybe birding magazines, even stuff on which nothing has been published, but there's unequivocal data out there on eBird, on Xenocanto, where you just have to go in and listen to the recordings, and it's clear to a blind person that these are two different species. We will adjudicate on them, and there have been many splits like that where we would have favored a split, voted in favor of a split that was not backed by any scientific literature at all. And I think that makes our taxonomic committee a little bit different from previous ones. I don't want to mention names, but I know that a lot of other taxonomic committees have this very stringent rule. They say, well, if you want to have a split or a lump, any change in taxonomic treatment, there's got to be a peer-reviewed paper in the scientific literature on that. We don't operate like that. We say that there's got to be information that's public or publicized, but it doesn't have to be published in the peer-reviewed arena. So a lot of our splits and lumps have been on the basis of information that's out there, but there's no peer-reviewed published paper on them. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
Great egrets are an interesting one. Someone in the AviList group may or may not be like actively working on that one right now. And, old world ones sound different from new world ones, like strikingly. Alba gives kind of this rattle call, and the ones here are sort of like a soft great blue heron, right? So, but it gets complicated when you start getting to some of the other taxa in Africa and in Southeast Asia, Australasia. So, fun questions still. Plenty of taxonomic riddles still out there.
Wow. Well, this is pretty monumental publication and shift, I think. A long time coming, obviously. And pretty heady stuff as well. We just got a few minutes left here, and I thought maybe we should share a couple sightings of birds that each of us have seen lately. I would be curious. Al, you literally, I feel like, just stepped off a plane. Like, yeah. I don't know, within 24 hours or so.
Yeah.
I'm shocked you're even here. What is a bird that you have communed with in the, say, past 7 days or so?
Well, we had some really wonderful birds on our Spring in Japan tour. including short-tailed albatross and, things that are just superbly cool birds, a lot of birds with Japan in the name, Japanese thrush and, or Izu robins, things like that. But after the tour ended, I had like half a day in Hokkaido. And apart from eating really great ramen, I decided to take a train down to this lake where I saw there'd been records of Latham snipe, which is a bird I'd never seen before. Highly migratory bird. It goes down to Australia and, and breeds mainly in Japan. I probably shouldn't say that it was probably in Korea and in Russia and all sorts of places, but, I always think of them as sort of this Hokkaido, northern Japan bird. And I got to see them displaying, and they were so different sounding than the snipe I've heard, the ones I know well. They're sort of really weird. They're still snipe winnowing, but I didn't see them on the ground ever. I got some photographs of them flying around, but actually seeing them, wanting to see them forever and having them displaying over my head was kind of one of those moments where, I'd wish we'd had time to do that during the main tour, and I was kind of scouting it for changes in the next version of this tour. But that really was fun, and there were some cool leaf warblers and other things I saw and heard where it was more impressive, the differences in sound between some of these birds and then the difference in look in some of these Philoscopus warblers. And they have good cool names, Sakhalin leaf warbler, so it's like that was like I just wanted to click that, like I've seen it, something with
nice.
Anything that's Kamchatka or Sakhalin or whatever, just
anything
so
from Sakhalin,
groovy,
Pretty good.
Anyway.
Latham snipe is a that's a birder's bird for sure. And I remember on our New Zealand cruise talking to a lady from Australia, and she's like, right near us, we have wintering Latham snipe. And I was like, man, how cool is that? Someday. I'll share. I think this last week, our buddy Dan Lane was in town. We did a little bit of birding, and me and him and Jason Weckstein hit Forsyths, known as Brigantine by many locals, and lots of shorebirds around. That was great. Good numbers of white rump sandpipers, but probably cooler still was the next day here, just in my local patch near my house, had a lovely olive-sided flycatcher teed up, which is, always sort of it's one of those ones you hope to see in migration here, but you're never really sure if you're going to see it. And the same day, a little further on, Dan and I are in the forest, and we see these two ovenbirds just sitting up, calling excitedly, and we were like, they gotta have a nest here. And we get a little closer, and we see that they're like really upset about a chipmunk. We scared the chipmunk off, and then Dan's like, there's a nest, ovenbird nest, 3 young, and that was, I don't ever remember finding an ovenbird nest before, so that was pretty exciting. So that was just a couple days ago.
Sounds like you still haven't. Sounds like Dan Lane's found one.
He scooped me right in my backyard. That's right. Yeah, Marshall, what about you? What have you been seeing?
I was just looking. It was 3 years ago that I was on with you guys, and I remember us talking a lot about the Arctic tern thing that happened. Yeah. So the one that's on my mind was most of my life is kind of taken up with taking my 8-year-old to and from soccer practice, to and from school, repeat, stay up late working on AviList, repeat, stay up late working on repeat. But it's May, and I try to make sure I'm watching the weather and picking my rare birding days well. So got clearance for the carpool for the morning, and ran down to Cape Cod on Friday after this big nor'easter. So we had a super rainy, like east winds day on Thursday, and then Friday was like the day that the winds come around to the northwest. So that traps all these seabirds in sort of the big arm of Cape Cod, sort of by the elbow. So First Encounter Beach is like the place to go. So I was there a little bit after dawn, and it was really fun for me driving in. I went there looking for the marquee birds for a May storm are phalaropes in high breeding plumage and Arctic terns. And I'm driving into First Encounter Beach, and I'm like a couple hundred meters from the actual beach, but there's this big salt marsh on the left, and it's flooded because the winds have been blowing the water in there. And there's a little, some shorebirds out there, and then a little flock of shorebirds flying around. And I look at the shorebirds, and they're like, I'm like, they're all red below. Like, are these red knots? What are these things? And I was like, they got these big wing stripes. Or curlew sandpiper? Wait, there's 6 of them. There can't be curlew sandpipers. It took me like an inordinately long amount of time to be like, oh no, those are red phalaropes. They got blown over the beach into the marsh, and you're just not used to seeing phalaropes flying over like marsh grass. But it took me like a really, and I love those moments where my brain, like for birds that I know, if I'd seen that same flock over the ocean, I would be like, red phalaropes going right. But over the salt marsh, I just like was misfiring, and finally realized what it was. So that was fun. We had a nice hit of Arctic terns. I ended up with 33 or something, but a lot of them were hard to get in the distance. But someone just north of me had 325. Really different type of event though than the one we talked about last time. That was just like a mind-blowing, like weird inland movement with fog and who knows why. This was sort of typical east winds blow them to shore. So anyway, that was just a great day of sea watching and like good people there to hang out and say hi to and stuff. But I'm going to steal one more because just prior to that, I'd been in Ithaca for a work week that was basically like, I don't even know if I'm going to get any birding in. It's just like, in a room all day and then socializing afterwards. But on the very last day, Jay McGowan was like, there's a hybrid mourning warbler X yellowthroat in Tioga County, just a half hour south. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm too tired. Like, I'm not going to do it. And then I hung up the phone with him and thought about it for like 20 minutes and called him back. And it's like, what time are we leaving to go see this thing? So we went down to this guy's farm. It is an Amish birders farm. There's like this really cool Amish birding community that's like some of the sharpest observers anywhere, like, running sort of organic farms. This guy has had Say's phoebe, scissor-tailed flycatcher, yellow rail.
I've heard about this. The yellow rail thing has happened more than once, right? It's like
and it's been like all the people come down and like he does these coordinated flushes of the yellow rail, just really really cool. So we got to go birding with him, and he took us out to this territorial mourning warbler X yellowthroat, which was not intermediate. It was intermediate in appearance, but the song was basically like a common yellowthroat at 0.75 play speed, just slightly slower. So really, really cool. There's only a few examples of that hybrid. And steering it back to taxonomy, a really cool example where, George and Alvaro and I grew up thinking of them as Operornis.
Right.
They're actually
a few years ago had been a cross genera hybrid, but no more.
Right. Genetics have straightened us out. It's just a, forest yellowthroat and an open country yellowthroat.
And I guess it also like makes me think of the point that with eBird, you have non-taxonomy type names like hybrids and types that will not be affected by your use of your AviList for your main taxonomy, right?
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, that's a good point to touch on. So the Clements revision, like we're going to do this next one in the fall. That'll get us like almost all the way there, and it'll probably be one more cycle before we're like fully synced up with AviList. And at that point, we will basically just like cease any independence from AviList. But we will continue to maintain these sort of birders taxa. Like Peep Spa has to be like formally entered in our taxonomy so that you can enter it in your eBird list. Same with any hybrid, and every year is like 3 or 4 new hybrid warblers.
Guys, we are nerding out thoroughly, and I know Frank has to go pretty soon, and I kind of sprang this question on you last minute, so I wanted to give Frank a quick go at a recent bird he's communed with before we let Frank scramble.
Yeah. By the way, George, I didn't know you all know each other over there in Maryland. Say hi to Jason from me.
Yeah.
So I'm very much an LBJ guy, little brown jobs. I love them. And so recently I had the chance to go. Living in Singapore, I don't get to see my family so much, my parents. And so we had a chance to all meet up on the coast, on the beach in Morocco to celebrate my father's 70th. And then I did this crazy side excursion driving literally 1,000 kilometers into the Western Sahara and searching for this Dunn's lark, which is a super rare lark species, a Saharan lark that's very much off the grid and very hard to see, very subtle. I think the way to say like how to identify it and everything, subtle is the word to use. And it was a spiritual experience. I found it the first afternoon. I spent another 2 days wanting to see my second individual because I'm a sucker for these. Am I allowed to say that? And but the first afternoon I spent a good 2 hours like soaking everything in, all these tiny little subtle plumage, like the mustachioal streak, very golden yellowish plumage compared to some of the other larks there. It was the best part of the year, I'm sure, for me.
That's awesome. The habitat was probably pretty cool too. There,
red dune habitat. This is a red dune specialist, and much of the Sahara, people might not. So red dunes are not necessarily covering the entire Sahara. It's like a habitat you need to seek out. So you drive across like hundreds of kilometers and you don't see any good habo, and then you stop somewhere and there's some good red dunes, and that's how I was lucky to see it. Yeah.
Wow. Cool. Fantastic. Well, listen, thanks so much, guys. We are really excited to see this AviList launched, and it's thanks for all the work you've done and the rest of the team as well. And yeah, thanks again.
And
thanks,
Stage
Al.
2 sounds exciting too.
Yeah,
Looking
phase
forward to
2, here we come. Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Marshall. We appreciate everybody listening. We'll be back again soon with another episode of Life List. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.